Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you here for a special story time Q&A tonight as a part of all that we're doing with our back to school edition. So we're really excited, but we'll give everybody a second just to get in here. And as some folks start to come on, we would love to hear in the chat where you're from, and maybe even, since this is a back to school edition, a favorite ice cream flavor, something like that. So where you're from, favorite ice cream flavor, we would love to hear from you as we start to get settled.
What are your guys' favorite ice cream flavors?
Raspberry chocolate chip.
Ooh, fancy, nice.
I know. Well, I'm actually allergic to ice cream, so I have to eat sorbets.
Oh.
So raspberry is kind of I have to go in the fruity element.
Gotcha.
But they're good.
Mine would be anything that has brownie bites.
Oh,
Ooh.
Jealous.
I always go back to one of the ones I loved as a kid was this Superman ice cream. And I always talk about this. It's all different colors, but it tastes like vanilla. And was just kind of this cool thing. Oh, I see some good ones in here. We have Carol from New York who loves orange creamsicle, which I completely agree with. Oh, actually, and yes, IOCDF Fran. Actually, I just had Halo Top before we got on. Actually, Halo Top. Yeah, I just had vanilla Halo Top with graham crackers and sprinkles. So I'm right there. I see cotton candy. Steve from the greater Boston area. And that was, I was going to say that, Fran is not in Atlanta. Yeah, that was Ethan who had Halo Top actually with me with sprinkles and graham crackers. Okay.
There's a core Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and it has a core center of solid brownie batter in the middle. It's really ridiculous. It's amazing. So shout out to Ben & Jerry's core ice cream.
I used to eat that caramel core all the time.
Yes. So bad for you, but so good.
I see Alexandra, Atlanta. I know very close to us. Coconut ice cream. Interesting. I like it. And Matthew, my nephew got Superman ice cream recently, and I got Smurf ice cream, blue and yummy. Yeah, the Superman is really, really neat because it feels like you're going to get something different. And then when it has the vanilla taste, yes, Ethan, Bluebell banana pudding, that too. All of the above. Okay. Well, feel free to continue to tell us where you're from, any ice cream flavors that you like, and we're going to go ahead and jump in. Oh, yes. Froyo, especially. Oh, yes. Yasso bars. They are absolutely the best. Love Yasso bars. That is definitely a staple for me as well. So thank you, Stephen. So this live stream is intended to serve as educational content and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please be sure to work with your local provider or contact a local clinician. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline and should not be used if you're in distress or feel unsafe. If you're in a crisis or if you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911, or call the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 800-273-8255. We also really want to create as safe a space as possible and encourage everyone to really be kind and to respect one another. With that said, this is being broadcast on a bunch of social media platforms and is being recorded. So please be mindful of that as you ask personal questions or leave comments. At the end of the day, we're all here to support one another. So just be respectful, and we're going to have a great conversation with a really special, unique town hall tonight. So I'm excited. I was sharing with Cali and Susan. I've been looking forward to this all day. So for those of you watching who I don't know, I'm Katie O'Dunn. I'm an IOCDF lead advocate, and I do a lot of our faith and mental health initiatives. I'm also an ultramarathon runner, so get to work with Cali with anxiety and athletes. And I'm an interfaith school chaplain who has OCD. So I get to be very open about that with my students as I help them navigate their own struggles on a daily basis, and spent most of the last 10 hours of the day helping my students navigate a lot of the struggles that we're talking about tonight. So really glad to be here as a part of our month on going back to school. So we're going to start tonight by introducing you to our awesome guests, and then we're going to have a special story time before we dive into some Q&A on anxiety in the classroom as we head back to school. So first, we have Cali Warner, and we're so excited to actually hear her book tonight. And she has not yet added this to her bio, but she is now officially an author. So that is really, really exciting. She is an athlete and clinician at McLean OCD Institute, Houston, and she's also obtaining her PhD at Baylor University. Her research focuses on competitive athletes with debilitating anxiety that negatively impact their performance. Cali's struggle with OCD began at the young age of 4, and she did not receive appropriate treatment until she was competing as a Division I athlete at Rice University. While at Rice, Cali won 9 conference championships and was named an honorable mention All-American in the 10K. She was able to reignite the love for her sport after receiving appropriate evidence-based care. Cali hopes to help others with mental illness know that they are not alone and that appropriate treatment is available to reobtain the joy that mental illness takes away. Cali recently qualified and competed in the U.S. Olympic Trials Marathon in 2020 and continues to pursue her passion for running while advocating for those struggling with mental illness through her research, therapy, and her own personal testimony. So clearly, Cali has a lot of time on her hands to be writing children's books, and we're super, super excited to have her here tonight.
Thank you, Kate. Excited to be here.
Yeah. And then super excited to have Susan Boaz here representing so many different facets of the IOCDF in personal experience as a mom and an advocate for everyone suffering from OCD and their families and friends, with a particular interest in pediatric and maternal OCD and its impacts on families. She also focuses on the autoimmune and inflammatory components of OCD and is the current ED of the Pandas Physician Network. Susan loves working with the youngest members of our community and their parents, and she's especially excited that the IOCDF is launching additional programs for kids and teens, like our online OCD Camp for Kids, which, if you were not there, was super fun and is coming back in January. And Susan is the current president of the IOCDF Board of Directors. In her spare time, she's an entrepreneur managing small businesses. So Susan, so excited to have you here for this special edition too.
Oh, glad to be here. I can't wait to hear the book.
Yeah. So this is a great time to turn this over to Cali, and I would encourage y'all to grab your popcorn. If you're in your PJs, snuggle up in your PJs or whatever you're wearing that's fuzzy after a day of school. If we have some of our kids watching, it is story time. So we're going to hear a special story from Cali. I have my book over here too, so I'm ready to follow along. Love her book, and I would encourage you to feel free to add comments or questions to the chat as we move through.
Yes, please add them. Happy to answer any questions about anything related to the book or just anxiety in general. So we're starting with Anxious Annie today, my first children's book that I've authored. And let me flip to the page that we'll start with. So this book is designated to everyone that has always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. This was me running at Rice. And you might notice some similarities to the character as we get started with the first page. Annie loves to run and is known for being fast. She runs every race with all her heart as if it were her last. Racing was not always as easy for Annie as it is today. Her fear and anxiety held her back, making her dread race day. Annie's anxiety began when she had to race against more kids than ever before. She felt so afraid and said she did not want to run anymore. Annie put so much pressure on herself to be the very best. Her fear was that if someone passed her, others might love her less. Since Annie thought she was only liked for her accomplishments, her anxiety continued to worsen. What Annie did not know was that everyone loved her for who she was as a person. So you see there's some people holding up signs in the background, and Annie can't see them. Annie stopped doing what she loved because she did not want to lose. So Coach Dana sat her down and gave her some very helpful news. Coach Dana said, "You only lose in life when you stop doing what you love most. Whether you win or lose, the people that care about you will continue to stay close. Your loved ones are proud of you for who you are and not what you do. And if you do the best you can, you should be proud of yourself too. Annie gathered up her courage and decided to lace up her shoes. She told herself with a new mindset, if I give my best effort, I have nothing to lose. Annie lined up at the starting line with excitement instead of fear. The announcer yelled, "Ready, get set, go," and Annie took off, listening to the crowd cheer. The race was fun for Annie because she had a better mindset. She knew that she would do her best, but that it was impossible to be perfect. Every step that Annie took was a step for her to be proud of. She smiled when she thought of her strength, and her heart filled with self-love. Annie crossed the finish line with her fastest time yet. She was excited that she did her best and finished with no regret. Annie continues to run the best she can, although she does not win every race. With each experience, her confidence grows, and to Annie, that is the real first place. The end. So that is Anxious Annie. And a little bit of background on that story. Coach Dana was actually my high school coach, Dana Fosmo. So he coached me in elementary school. He was our PE teacher. And so he did all the turkey trots and then told me I was going to run for him once I got to high school. And so he kind of followed me all the way through and is still like a second dad to me today. So it was really neat. I didn't tell him that I was writing the book. And I surprised him with it in a gift bag. And he opened it and was really shocked and surprised. But it looks just like him. I should have had a picture for you guys to see the comparison.
I love that, Cali. And this is just so awesome. And I already see we have a ton of comments in the chat about folks talking about how much this would have helped them as a kid and how many kids this will help. So as we start to kind of have a conversation about the book and about anxiety and heading back to school, of course, our kiddos are welcome to stay on past story time, but are welcome to go to bed at any point if necessary. But I would also encourage all of you to feel free to put comments in the chat, to feel free to put questions in the chat, whether they relate to the book or also anxiety going back to school, what this might look like for our kiddos as a part of our theme tonight. So as we kick off, I really just want to ask Cali, what inspired you to write the book? And you said this a little bit, but I know this has a lot to do with your story. So I wonder how you got from there to this book.
Yeah, I think, well, growing up, I didn't have a healthy mindset with running to start with. And as I got more success in high school and started looking at colleges, the pressure just became so intense. And because of my brain couldn't really handle the uncertainty of what was going to happen in a specific race, it geared all of its energy towards OCD. And so I was thinking about all these intrusive thoughts because my brain could try to handle that, except until it couldn't anymore, I guess. And so I just needed a message at that point in my life to know that, I was loved no matter the outcome of the race. And it was easy to forget that when I was so intertwined with all of my compulsions and trying to compete for life, to be liked, I guess, because I was always quite the people pleaser. And the reality of it all was that I was loved, that nothing would change, whether I won or lost, I would still continue on with my life. And that healthy mindset took a long time to be able to practice, but it did take off some of the extra stress. And we know that this stress increases OCD symptoms. And so I just felt like it was important to give this message to younger kids because unless you're going through it, you don't know. And so that's what I had wished someone had told me at that point in my life. And I did have a great sense of support. But I was also very good at keeping my struggle internal. So they didn't know the extent of what was going on.
Yeah, thanks, Cali. And I see, we have some folks that are asking. It is not a kids only live. This is a for everybody live stream. And I think as you can hear the book, and I always think we can learn so much as adults from children's books too. So even though this is story time and we're talking about back to school, I think we can all gain from this. And we definitely encourage folks to ask questions as a whole about OCD as well. You're welcome to ask questions about kids and families, but also your experience with OCD and anxiety. And I love this pull in to anxiety in athletes. And I want to toss this back over to you, Cali. Did OCD ever help you in a race? And this is something we talk a lot about in anxiety in athletes. So I wonder, did it ever help you in a race?
That was my fear, that there was this fear component because of stigma, that if I were to get treatment, what if my races would be negatively impacted? And it absolutely was not the case. OCD did not help me. If anything, it caused me to reach burnout a lot quicker than I would have wanted to, and just became completely exhausting. So I started resenting racing altogether, because a race didn't only mean fun time with, or for me, it didn't mean fun time with teammates at all. It meant these time-consuming rituals and compulsions that led me feeling really trapped. And so the answer is no. And even if, someone could argue, there was this one compulsion I would do that if I had to go for a long run, I would end on an even number. And I will never forget, someone said, well, aren't you running up like one more mile? Isn't that helpful to you to get that extra mileage in so that you're training? And I said, well, maybe, but we know that OCD symptoms usually increase without appropriate treatment. And so that 1 mile became 2 miles, and that 2 miles became, oh, well, I need to get on another even number. And so then again, one more contributor to burnout. So if it's one little compulsion that's not causing harm, we know that that's okay until it's not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the claimer at 7:15, I'm so glad that you asked that, because I think oftentimes there's this notion that, OCD can help us in athletics, or OCD can make us better athletes. And just like Cali said, it's really not the case. And it's really when we can navigate OCD with evidence-based treatment that we can live into the athletic career that we want and that we deserve, and be that best athletes that we can be. So I wonder, along with this book, and Susan, I think you're hearing this book for the first time, which is really exciting. With all of the work that you do, especially with kids and OCD, how do you really hope students might gain from this book as they head back to school? What are some things that you think this really might help them with? Are there particular struggles you think they might be having as they head back to school, particularly our students with OCD?
Well, there were a couple themes in the story. I really loved it, Cali. By the way, that was great. There's so many more books for kids now than there were, but there's still such a need for very specific books about the different worries that kids have. But the kind of the couple of moments that I really noticed as you were reading it was that moment when, she was turned outward to the page and her supporters were behind her and she really just couldn't see them. Like, she just couldn't see them. And that helpful moment of turning around and looking at who loves you for who you are, I think is really important to kids in so many areas, because whether it's athletics or, academics, or, having the cutest dress on, or cleaning your room, whatever it may be, perfectionism never helps us. And in fact, always holds us back. And so I love that moment of like, hey, what matters is that you're doing your best, and that you can turn around and see all those faces that love you and actually see them, right? Not just look past them. So I thought that was great. And then that whole piece around kind of perfectionism, in whether it's racing or needing to be the best, I just think that's so helpful. And you can restate that for whatever the child is worried about. Like, I could totally see reading this book and being like, okay, every time she's talking about a race, you're talking about,
right.
I was definitely a perfectionist kid, and I wish along the way someone had said, like, let's try writing that paper a little shorter and see what happens instead of staying up all night.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, the ultimate big picture, instead of just focusing on that one moment and what that one moment means, is important. And it's similar with OCD. When you're stuck with intrusive thoughts, you're not really able to hear what's going on around you. And so you miss a lot. Versus being able to get appropriate treatment, then you can be more present and see, like, this life is amazing and can be amazing, and I can have it back.
Yeah, and I think so, Cali. Maybe for some who are listening who might know a little bit more about evidence-based treatment, they might not. But can you talk a little bit about the treatment and about exposure and response prevention and how that helped you when you were very reflective of the little girl in the book and how you got from point A to point B like she did through evidence-based treatment.
Right. So I shortened my life story in this book. Annie got treatment a lot earlier than I did. But for me, I didn't receive treatment until I was 21, as mentioned in the bio. And it was a long journey looking back from age 4 until then. Of course, there were ups and downs along the way because, like we said earlier, life stressors can increase and exacerbate OCD symptoms. And so in college, around my sophomore year, that was when I was in the most intense race scenario, trying to qualify for nationals, was taking a few too many difficult classes at Rice University for my taste. And so it all kind of just piled on top, and the OCD became unbearable to a point where I wasn't able to go into public restrooms by myself. I would wait until I got home off campus, which isn't good to do, especially when you're a distance runner that's supposed to drink water all day long. And so things like that became really difficult. And finally, I did, over Christmas break, receive evidence-based exposure response prevention, which is what we do to, when we have an OCD fear, our tendency is to avoid it altogether or engage in some type of compulsion to immediately relieve that anxiety, but only temporarily. And then oftentimes the compulsion comes back stronger the next time around. And so the therapist that worked with me was very compassionate, introduced me to exposure response prevention, which is when we, little at a time, start to introduce those fears that you started to avoid that got you in that place in the first place. So this therapist really walked me through being able to do certain things, such as taking a risk of not quadruple tying my shoes, and just trying to, at first, maybe retying them 3 times and then going to run a race and seeing, oh, wait, that didn't affect my race. I didn't get last place, which was one of the fears I had associated with quadruple tying my shoes. And so just one step at a time that I could bear. And then little by little, I started to get my life back. And with much fewer compulsions leading to races, the love for my sport came back as well. Does that explain ERP in a good enough sense? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love that you talked about too, the joy finally being able to come back in your sport, and that it was a process and it was something over time, but you were able to get that joy back by doing this treatment that sometimes can feel really challenging. And again, I would encourage, if folks have questions, yes, it can be about the book and it can be about kids and anxiety and going back to school, but we're also happy to answer questions about OCD treatment and about ERP. So feel free to ask anything it is that you're navigating. But Cali, I remember you saying with your story too, that your coach was really, really supportive. So I wonder, what did that look like? How was your coach able to support you through that process? And then I want to kind of pull that into going back to school and what that might look like for some of our educators.
Of course. Yes. So he was patient. I think that's the most important piece. At the time, since he didn't know that I had OCD, there was a little bit of reassurance going on, but I think for educators, it's just important to point them to the right resources, which is why Anxiety in the Classroom is so helpful, because all of the resources are listed there. But his patience was probably the biggest component, but also just telling me, just like in the book, that there is a bigger picture, that it doesn't your whole life isn't defined by this one moment, and you're worth so much more. And so to have someone tell Cali, a second grader, all the way up, luckily I had this relationship with him all through high school, that message being ingrained in me over and over, it finally started to stick. And then I was able to see that my worth was a lot more. And just like Katie was saying, there's individuals that struggle with test taking or wearing a certain outfit because they want to please their peers. They all need that same message too, of your value's not in this one moment. Or if someone gets embarrassed, social anxiety, because they say the wrong thing in a classroom, just knowing that there's so much more to this life than just this moment can take some of that pressure off, because the kids that are usually anxious are the ones that are putting 10 times more the pressure on themselves than they need to anyways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, I see this all the time with my students. And I think a lot of times I recognize this as someone with OCD and someone who navigates anxiety. And I see myself in them when I was that age. And it breaks my heart when they are struggling in that way. And when they come up after class and it's, oh, Chaplain K, is everything going to be okay? I did this thing wrong, or I didn't do this perfectly, or whatever it is with a sock or with a homework assignment or whatever. And it absolutely breaks my heart, because I want to be able to say, one, let's help you get the treatment that you need. But two, it is more than about this one moment, and you are so valued and you are so loved, and all of those things. So I love that we have these resources. And Susan, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what we have actually with anxiety in the classroom. What does that look like? What has the IOCDF been working to build out around that?
Yeah, and before I go to that, I just wanted to say that when my daughter was, I think she was about 6 years old in first grade, she came home saying, Mom, I was really mean to a kindergartner today. And I was like, well, we don't do that in our family. Like, obviously, we're kind to the little kids, and like, you're a big kid now, blah, blah, blah. And like, by the third day of her coming home and confessing that she'd been mean to the kindergarten, I was like, okay, this feels a little odd. Like, why is she coming home and telling me this? And that's really at that point in that stage that we learned about scrupulosity and what it looked like in a little kid. And I'd heard of scrupulosity for adults and around religion and faith, but I'd never really seen scrupulosity in confessing or imagined what that might have looked like for a small child. And so that was just an interesting thing to deal with, and to try to overcome that compulsion to confess and to doubt whether or not, what she'd really done. So that just really resonated when you're talking about that. I think even our littlest ones feel that confession, that urge to be perfect and kind. And, a lot of times they are, or even if they're not, it doesn't matter. But that questioning of whether I was is such a big deal. So anyway, that just resonated. I wanted to speak to that really does happen even in the littlest ones. And so scrupulosity is something that if you feel like you might be seeing in your child, is definitely an area to look up and learn more about. We also experienced scrupulosity with her needing to say, I love you, Mom. So instead of praying to God, she was really sort of like looking to me as the sort of that authority figure in the home, and then needing me to be alive, needing me to value her. And so there was a lot of complexity around that, but that kind of ERP treatment that Cali was talking about is really kind of the way to go. But you were asking earlier about what resources we have. So we actually just fully launched, we've been working on it for a couple of years, our Anxiety in the Classroom website. And I think that the team behind the scenes will stick that in the chat. But we have some great information there. And there's a section for teachers who work in the school system, counselors, administrators. They can go to that section and really get great resources for how they can help kids in their system. There's a section for parents or guardians of children where they can go and really learn how to deal with things at home, or also how to deal with things going back to the classroom. So setting up IEPs, or just working with a teacher or a counselor to help them understand OCD. And then one of my favorite sections is called I Am a Student, where kids can click there and they can learn more information about OCD, about how to share with others, how to put together presentations, all kinds of great things. So just a great resource for everybody. And that is link is actually up in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Susan. And thank you so much for sharing about that experience of what Scroop can look like with the youngest kids too. And even you sharing that, it reminds me so much of when I was that age. And that's one of the reasons it's really emotional for me when I see that in my students, and I want to just make it all better. I can think back to when I was 7 and 8 and, would call my parents into my room every single night to confess every single thing that I thought I did wrong at school. And I can remember even one time going to a friend's birthday party, and I felt like I hadn't stuck up for that. A friend had lied about the time that we went to bed, and I didn't say anything. And I remember for a week thinking that I was the worst person ever, that I needed to go to jail, that I was going to go to hell, that everything was just going to be awful. And confessing to my mom, confessing to my pastor. And that was my whole childhood. Everything was, I'm a horrible person. And I was this 7 or 8 year old kid getting the citizenship award every year and trying to help people. Right. And it's heartbreaking when I see that in my students. And I'm so glad we have resources like Anxiety in the Classroom to help educators recognize this, but also to help our students navigate. So I wonder either Susan or Cali along these lines, and then I'm going to dive into, I know we have some great questions in the chat too, but I'm also wondering, I think as an educator, I think helping students advocate for themselves is so incredibly important. And with those resources that we have, what do you think is the best way for students maybe who are navigating an anxiety disorder or who are navigating OCD? How can they advocate for accommodations in the classroom? What's the best way for them, maybe, especially for some of our older students, to present that maybe to teachers or to administrators?
We can both answer. I'll go first because I get this a lot in clinical work. And I think it's helpful to, if the students talk with a therapist about it and kind of work on a plan to see what accommodations would be helpful, because sometimes the student might just go with the parents before receiving treatment or care and ask for these accommodations that are just feeding the OCD more. And so having a specific plan of, a therapist might say to the teacher or get a release of information to speak with the teacher themselves and say, hey, we're working on this in therapy, so the student can have this accommodation of showing up late to class, maybe because they're washing their hands too long in the bathroom for the next 4 weeks. But the expectation is that we eliminate that over time, so that they're not just stuck having this accommodation forever, because we know that it could exacerbate symptoms worse. So speaking with a therapist to work directly with the teacher is probably my first response to that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it really depends on the child's comfort level with people knowing what's going on. So we have some kids who really are very comfortable being advocates, and then we have others that are going to be in public, and we have others who are probably going to do great things behind the scenes to support others privately, right? So one of the things that I always say to students when they're sort of thinking about what they can do is that if you're really comfortable, you don't have to say that you have OCD, but you can do a classroom presentation about OCD and educate people on what it really is. Maybe talk about one of the subtypes of OCD that doesn't get talked about as much. So you can do those kinds of presentations, whether you're saying I have OCD or not. It's certainly very powerful if you are able to share a little bit about that, but that depends on how much support you have and how comfortable you are with that. But that whether you want to do that or not, another thing that you can really do that begins to advocate for everyone is to understand someone else who has a mental health disorder. And you can really sort of empower yourself by being kind or asking someone about what their challenges are and trying to understand that, and maybe sharing your story privately with a trusted person, because that's the kind of thing that really starts to eliminate shame within our entire communities. And that's something that you can do very privately and on your own pace. So whether it's sharing your story or whether it's just trying to understand someone else's story that is willing to share, being a part of that community really helps everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Susan. I think in whatever way is comfortable for students to do that is so incredibly important. And it can be so helpful. Of course, it has to be in a way that's comfortable for them as they kind of connect with others, but also destigmatize things for both themselves and for others. And then Cali, thank you for the piece with the accommodations. I think I struggle with that with my own students, where often I'll have students come in with accommodation sheets. And sometimes it will be for OCD, and it'll say they'll be anxious and you can't do this, and this in class. And I actually worry because I want to have those conversations, or I'm hoping that therapists want to have those conversations with me about how are we going to pull some of these things back and what does that look like over time. So I love that you do that. And I'm really hopeful that that's something that both families and therapists can work with educators on, so that we can work together as a part of that process.
Yeah, of course. And to add to that advocacy component, I think it's helpful to, if a student's not sure how much they want to disclose, to do it a little bit at a time. That was the approach that I took when I started working as a clinician, actually, was dipping my toe in the advocacy side. And then just a little at a time, I would share a part of my story, maybe with 1 or 2 patients, and then to see how much of a sense of hope that they got from hearing my story and my recovery just filled me up to want to be able to share more and more until I was comfortable sharing everything. So it's nice for them to be able to get that positive affirmation to know, hey, it's going to be okay, but they have to do it at the pace that they're ready.
That's right. And I think my daughter really found her first advocacy, first thing that sort of filled her up and made her more comfortable sharing her story was actually sharing her story with little kids and with parents. And then, really seeing how even as I think she was 12, how as a 12-year-old, a 7-year-old really looked up to her as, oh, okay, she has it, so do I, so I'm going to be okay because she's okay. And sort of that was a very powerful experience for her. And if you do get chances to, talk to a parent or in a safe space, share with a younger child, I think that's one of the great things about our conferences, whether they're virtual or in person, is that you really do get the chance to be in a very open and friendly environment where everyone else is going through the same thing, but you get to talk to, whether it's a parent who maybe is like, oh, I don't know what to do, for my teenager. And you're like, oh, I've already, the kid's like, oh, I've already been there, I've done that. Here's how I would want my parents to react. It's a really pretty powerful thing to find anywhere that you can share a little bit of your story.
Right. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I love that the conference piece. And then like we talked about our kids camp too. I just think that was, I loved getting to be there with some of them a couple weeks ago and just seeing, like you said, parents, but also kids connect and see, oh, wait, someone else has OCD and we connect on so much more than our OCD. And maybe I'm so much more than my OCD and we can do this thing together. And it's really cool. It's really cool. So looking back to the chat, wanted to say thank you so much for sharing. OJ at 724, you got treatment 18 years late, and even after losing your dad and dropping out of school, you worked really hard to go through therapy. So thank you so much for sharing that. And you now solidified your dream job as a mathematician, and you're really attributing the IOCDF and treatment to that. So we're super proud of you, and thank you so much for sharing that inspiration with others who might be struggling in the midst of trauma and loss, and also maybe getting treatment much later than we would like for them to. So that's so hopeful. I wonder if we can dive into, at 725, Mustafa, your question: how do educators make an interactive environment that accommodates students with anxiety? Cali, do you have any thoughts on that?
First off, educating themselves will probably be the best piece, but then it's helpful to, if they can, dive into it just from a general standpoint so that no student feels like they're being pinpointed, and just giving some general education on these are things that you guys might struggle with, especially coming out of COVID and having students be fully in the classroom after quarantining and having less social interaction. So just normalizing it as much as they can give students the confidence maybe to speak up or to seek help when they need it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Susan, do you have any thoughts on that, and maybe what's been helpful in your household with educators?
I think being able to talk to the parents and the therapist, if there is one, is the most helpful thing. I really want to reflect that against what Cali said, but I also think setting small goals for all students. So I like to say ERP is courage training. And so I don't really care what kind of courage training you're doing. The smallest things really do help someone build the muscles in their brain that help them learn that they can overcome fearful situations. So I'll dial this back and say, let's take something that almost every child is afraid of, which is presenting in front of others. Okay. So whether you have severe anxiety and you're afraid of that, or whether you just haven't done it before and it sounds like a terrible idea, presenting in front of others is something that builds courage. And so what I really encourage educators to do is, instead of having the child present because they're learning something about information, is be like, I want you to present on something that excites you, and I want you to learn how to have courage to be in front of a group. And if you have a child that is extremely anxious doing that, perhaps the great moment of courage that the entire classroom can celebrate in is standing up and holding a poster that says, I learned about dolphins today. Okay. If that walking to the front of the classroom is an example of great courage for that child, then that's what we want to celebrate. And so we look for ways to have every child take that tiny step forward. So whatever the limitations are, whatever's on the list of accommodations that we're doing, I don't think that's as important. That's important, don't get me wrong, but that's not as important in building an interactive classroom as building moments of courage and recognizing those. So if the child is afraid they might do something wrong, in our home, we like to be fun about it and be like, okay, we're all afraid of doing something wrong. Let's all in the classroom do a math problem wrong and see if the world comes to an end. let's all hand that math problem to the child next to us, and everyone's going to write an F or a 0 in big red ink. And we hand out red ink to every child in the classroom. We all get a 0. And then we all laugh about it. And it's a way of saying, you know, it really is okay. And then we say, now let's all do the problem the right way. And let's talk about how we've learned to do this. So I think just finding ways to acknowledge what the fear is, and then to overcome that fear and to put it in a way that it goes across as many children as possible. So it's not, you know, oh, Annie is afraid to run. It's more, lots of people are afraid to run. Lots of people have rituals. Let's break a ritual today. What, you know, does anybody want to toss out what a ritual is that they would have the courage to break today, and see what happens when they run the race? And so maybe we do this in practice, and we're like, okay, has everybody picked their ritual? Everybody do the opposite of that. And now let's all run and see if we can still hit our fastest time, right? That's the sort of work where we can be like, oh, look, 6 people hit their fastest time and 6 people didn't. So odds are it had nothing to do with breaking your ritual. It's finding things like that normalize the fact that we all have moments of fear. We all have moments where we need to overcome that and have courage, whether it's OCD or just regular life. We can, as educators, it's not our job to cure the OCD. It's our job to teach the child and create a safe environment.
I love that moments of courage piece, and I really love framing it like that. I think that's so wonderful, and recognizing again that looks different for each person, and what you were saying about even standing up and holding the poster. I know I've had some students that it's a win that will decide, hey, for their presentation that they really need, even as a 12th grader, that it'll be me, and they get to pick a best friend, and they'll stand at the front of the room in front of the 2 of us during the lunch period.
Yep.
And it is such a win just to have them get up there and do that. And they are so proud of that. And that is a moment of courage. And it's a neat thing. I really love that. So I think I love all of these answers. And I think there are so many different ways for educators to create that interactive environment. I think if there are any educators listening, some of that is also being vulnerable yourself, and letting students know that they are maybe not the only ones that are having a tough time. And I always try to walk the line with my students between, I never want them to feel like they have to worry about me or take care of me, but I also want them to know that they're not alone in their struggles. So I talk all the time about the fact that, yes, their chaplain works with the IOCDF and has OCD and is in a really good place, but navigates treatment and helps other folks navigate treatment. And it took me such a long time to do that. For many years working as an educator and a chaplain in a pretty public role, I didn't want anybody to know. I thought that they would see me differently. And since I started opening up to my students, I have lines of students every day that come in to talk about what it is that they're navigating. And I think that's true for so many educators. There's so many mentors for students that our own vulnerability really gives them the opportunity to say, oh, wait, my teacher or my mentor or my coach, they struggle with stuff too. So you know what? I'm going to talk to them about it, and we can navigate this together, and I'm not alone. And I think that really can create such a neat environment in the classroom.
Yeah, especially when you have a posting like that as the chaplain of the school, just showing that you're human and you have your struggles is another way to normalize it and make the students feel like they're not an outlier, that they're not the only one.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the first things I say to parents when I start talking to a parent who's newly navigating OCD is, hey, what resources are you doing for yourself? And the first thing I say is I've been in therapy for anxiety-based issues for a really long time, and it's still something that I continue to navigate. And, it's kind of a joy at this point to overcome fears as opposed to something awful, because I know how much it opens up my life. And I'm amazed sometimes at the places where I find that I have fears that I was like, really? I was scared of that, But I like to tell parents that, because I think, they often are like, oh, you're the president of the OCD Foundation. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm a parent. I'm a parent, and I'm doing some things that I love to do that I'm really passionate about. But you too can get treatment for yourself for the very natural anxiety. Even if you're not someone that has anxiety normally, having a child with OCD may cause you to have some anxious thoughts or some concerns and worries, and having a resource to really talk to, that's great. And more than that, you can then tell your kid, hey, I'm going to therapy whether your child, like I saw someone earlier was asking about a child who is resistant to treatment. And what I generally say to parents, first off, is go yourself. Go yourself so that you can start to talk about it in a more normalizing way. That if you have the courage to go to treatment, that sets a great example that even if it's not today, your child will someday be able to see that courage and have the courage to go to treatment themselves. This is not a marathon. I thought it was so funny that I was invited to talk with y'all because I'm a walker occasionally. I was like, oh, marathons and the Olympics. That's great. So what am I talking about? I'm a walker. But I think really just kind of trying to normalize all of that and bringing that all back together is just so important.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead, Cali.
I was humbled not too long ago at the Olympic trials, I believe it was, my OCD symptoms kind of exasperated around that time. And this was after I had been treating patients for a couple of years and was in a really good place with my OCD. And so I remember thinking, what, I'm not supposed to struggle. Like that's not allowed. Like I can't struggle and treat OCD at the same time, but that's not what I preach at all to my patients. I teach that progress is not linear and that it takes time and there's going to be ups and downs. And so it was just a wake up call for me to really check myself and say, I tell everyone else that this happens and I'm not superhuman. It's going to happen to me at times too. And so I've just got to do some of my own ERP here and there to get back where I was.
And it's funny, Cali, you talked about that on the podcast with me, on my podcast not that long ago. And I actually think about you sharing that often because I really look up to you with the Olympic trials and everything like that. And having you be able to say, okay, I was really struggling at that particular time is even really inspiring for me. And I know I navigate that so often. My biggest OCD relapse was while serving in a chaplain role. I had lost a student that I was really close to, and I completely tanked with my OCD. It was really bad. And I was so ashamed because I was working with kids on a daily basis. And it was like, who am I to be struggling? Who am I to be in treatment at night? How can I work with these kids and be struggling as much as I am with these intrusive thoughts and with everything that's going on? And, coming out of that, while it was a really tough time, it really gave me the vulnerability to be where I am now with advocacy, to open up to those students and to realize, oh, wait, we're not above struggling just because we're in ministry or just because we're clinicians. We struggle just like everyone else, and we get to walk with folks in their struggles, and we have to do our own treatment and our own stuff. And I think you being able to say, hey, at the Olympic trials, I was struggling. And also I lived into my values and went out and raced and had an awesome day. Like, how cool is that?
Right. And when I always tell patients that one of my mottos is, I will never ask you to do an exposure I wouldn't be willing to do myself. And so I really try to hold myself accountable to that. So of course, when I came home, the OCD didn't automatically just go away. I had to work back to where I was. And there were so many times where I would want to seek reassurance, but I would be reminding myself as I would tell someone, hey, don't forget to lean into uncertainty. Shoot, I need to do that as well. So it's got to go both ways there.
I liked, Katie, when you said lean into your values. And I think that's so helpful. I know when we were talking earlier about what administrators or teachers can do to build that sort of interactive classroom, in addition to building those moments of courage, you can also build an understanding of what your core value is. So when we talk about core values, sometimes people are like, oh, to get straight A's. I'm like, that's not actually a core value. Core value might be to lean into my passions and to work as hard as I can. Maybe another core value might be to be kind to others or to be a good friend. And all of those things can also get complex with OCD. So we have to be super careful about them. But once we find our core value, then we can at least start to have conversations around what that core value is. And so for one child, it might be, learning to be a really good friend. And for another child, it might be following their passion. And for the child where it's following their passion, you might notice that they're struggling in math a little bit because that's not in one of their passion areas. So then you can start to talk about it from a different value, which is like, well, let's talk about what your passion area is and will math actually help you there? That works for OCD as well, right? So when you're trying to overcome fear, whatever your passion is, leaning into that is really going to help you overcome those fears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the value piece we know is so important. And I like you said, it can get sometimes a little sticky in figuring those things out with OCD. But I always think about in talking with students who, in kind of working alongside their therapists, remind them like, oh, a lot of times the things your OCD is latching on to are actually your values, and that's one of the ways to kind of figure out what those values are. If your OCD is sticking on it, chances are it's a value that you maybe should be living into or can try to live into. And for me, that's been a big component of recovery. I think along with the educator perspective too, just for any other educators listening, I think really huge are things like even just having check-ins and check-outs for students. I know we do roses, buds, and thorns before every single class. It's worth the 10 minutes for students to say how they're doing if they really feel like it. And we have in my classes a checkout form every day that they do on Google Docs where there's a feelings wheel and they can say kind of what's going on, what they're going through, something that's really important to them right now. And it's amazing when you open the door how much students really will share with you and how much they want to share if you give them that window. And for educators, that might be a window to finding out a student struggling that you wouldn't know that otherwise, and maybe no one would know that otherwise. So I think that's another way of creating that kind of open and safe environment.
That's so great. I don't think anyone ever asked me how I was doing when I was in school. So I think that's so terrific. Every time I see something like that on Instagram, a teacher sharing how they're doing that, the check-ins at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, I just think that's so brilliant and gives kids so many opportunities to really disclose how they're doing and then to normalize that and to connect kids maybe with someone else that's having some similar feelings. It's great.
Yeah, I wish that teachers would have asked me when my little clip got moved from green to yellow for talking, how I was feeling about that, because that was never a happy moment for me.
Well, and they love it with class. They always write at the end of the year evaluations, roses, buds, and thorns are their favorite part of the day. And their checkout forms, they love the feelings wheel. And I always tell other teachers, like, use the feelings wheel in a checkout form. And by the end of the year, I work with 18-year-olds and they'll walk into class and say, oh, Chaplain K, I'm feeling like this on the feelings wheel. And they'll refer to the feelings wheel like as a thing of, this is just how we feel. We feel like something on the feelings wheel. And I think to normalize that is cool. It's very cool. So looking into the chat, we have a question that's a little bit different from what we're talking about, but I think really important along the lines of OCD. And at 727, we have Blackie McCarthy asks, what would be the most suitable treatment for pure O and how would it work on intrusive thoughts? So Cali, maybe you can talk a little bit about what intrusive thoughts are. And when we're talking about kind of pure O, what we're talking about when you can't necessarily see the compulsions, but they still exist. What does that look like?
Yeah, I was going to say we're steering away from pure O now because we find that the majority of the time when you're triggered, there still is some type of compulsion. It's just normally mental. So when you have these types of obsessive thoughts, there's a few things that you can do to bring yourself back to the present. But again, one of those big reminders to tie it back in is living towards your values. So when we looked at Anxious Annie and how she was facing away from the crowd, at that time she was living in her head and the symptoms were overcoming her. But if she were living in her values, she would be looking around her and interacting with her peers because that's a value-based living trait for her. And so when you're struggling with an obsessive thought such as maybe over apologizing or did I offend somebody? You might be obsessing over and over, playing the conversation over and over in your head, which would be the compulsion, right? So trying to figure out, did I offend that person when I said it? Did it come out in this type of tone? So the exposure, if you will, would be to remind yourself, okay, I'm moving forward with my day. I'm not going to continue to figure this out. Something I personally like to do, I heard this somewhere and it really works for me. I try not to move my eyes for a little bit because that takes your full attention instead of ruminating. So if I can try not to move my eyes, then that's one step further towards me moving forward with my day, which is the exposure, because I'm trying not to solve whether or not I had offended someone anymore.
I think for little kids too, so intrusive thoughts are complicated, right? And when you have a little kid who maybe is having an intrusive thought, let's say they think, if I don't count to five times, then my mom might die. Okay. Well, that's obviously a very scary and very intense thought that now they're going to need to count to five times. And if they mess up one of the times and count to 6, then they're going to have to restart that entire process. Right. So the way that we dealt with that in our home with little kids for the parents that are on is that we often use singing to overcome some of those intrusive thoughts. So once we kind of understood what the intrusive thought was, and, you know, we would make up songs about it. And I will just tell you guys, I won't do this on the Facebook Live tonight unless it was my thing, but we would sing songs about some of the wildest things, you know? So if she was afraid that if her intrusive thought was, I'm going to throw up if I eat that, and the action was actually avoidance of not eating something, as opposed to that first step being eating it, which was often way too overwhelming for her, we might sing and build up to the fact that she would throw up. Like it was almost definite that she would throw up if she had ice cream. And so we would start with, you know, singing the facts of, I'm scared that I will throw up if I eat ice cream. And it was actually an exposure just to sing the word throw up, right? That was tough just to get that through. So sometimes she couldn't sing it and she would ask me to sing it, and I would sing that first verse for her, and she might chime in on a couple of words, because again, moments of courage can be super tiny, right? And they do build up over time. And I could tell all of the parents that from dealing with a child at age 3 who had very severe debilitating OCD. And again, at 6 and 9, to now having a 19-year-old in college who also has had some challenges during that experience, but overall is doing extremely well and is living a full life. So, you know, those tiny moments of courage that seem like, oh, you know, you're not going to brag about it. Like somebody's like, oh, my kid scored 12 goals today in soccer. And you're like, great, my kid sang the word throw up. Like, I don't know how to talk about it. Right? But it is the biggest thing that child is building a resiliency that will absolutely pay off for them in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that the singing aspect. And, you know, it's funny, even as an adult going through exposures, we use singing for, you know, with the question about intrusive thoughts. I navigated some pretty intense, violent and sexual intrusive thoughts. And we used to sing about them to row your boat in therapy. Yeah. And it's the best. My therapist used to tell me I would literally get home from teaching children all day and sing about my sexual and violent intrusive thoughts in the shower to row your boat, because that's what I was supposed to do as a part of my exposures, which sounds weird.
No, it sounds courageous.
Yeah, it was kind of moments of courage for me. And I know the asking the Puro question, and that can be really tough. And yeah, like Callie said, we're trying to kind of shift away to saying that yes, the compulsions exist. We just can't necessarily see those things. But I've struggled with that so much. And I think it can be so challenging, like Callie was saying, when there are things that you can't necessarily see, when you can't necessarily stop just a physical compulsion, but being able to acknowledge and do the exposures just like you would anything else. For me, it's been so much about coming back to the present. And one of the things that I say with kids actually is the 3 M's. And this sounds kind of silly. I do it like in the form of a cow. When OCD moves, give it the 3 M's, and it's more, maybe, move on. And that's particularly for things that come up in your head of being able to say, oh, I have this scary thought. Okay, more, bring it on. Maybe it's true. And then move on. And that's, for me, something outside of just for kids, something that's really helped me with that intrusive thought piece and with the ruminating of being able to quickly say, I noticed that this is here. All right, bring it on. Maybe it's true. I'm going to move on with my life. And I think eventually for me, after a lot of ERP, that became more of kind of an automatic thing of being able to at least notice that those things were happening.
Yeah. Or don't feed the OCD monster is one that I refer to a lot. It's a good way for kids to recognize, every time I do that compulsion, that monster's getting a little bit bigger and that thought's going to stick around a little bit longer.
And it's interesting to have, whether you're a kid or an adult, to do some detective work. So if you feel like you have purely obsessions and no compulsions, and, you know, if that's true, there's ways to absolutely deal with that. A lot of the times we do find that there are compulsions, but we have to really do some detective work to figure out what that is and to make sure we understand fully what compulsions can be. So I'll just give an example. If, you know, I had a child who was terrified of ice cream, And so over time, I realized we didn't go down the ice cream aisle, and we weren't going in the ice cream store, and we weren't eating ice cream. It kind of happened without our realizing it was happening. So it was hard to say that there was a compulsion because there was no anxiety that was visible unless we went towards an ice cream store. And then it was very visible, right? Like if we suddenly were traveling and there was an ice cream store where there wasn't one in our town, I was like, oh, let's go get ice cream, all hands off on that one, that we were definitely not going in there. And then suddenly we could see that the compulsion was not to be even near ice cream, not to talk about ice cream, not to draw pictures of ice cream, not to list favorite ice creams. Like earlier today, we said, list your favorite ice cream. Well, for my child, that would have been a moment of courage to list that favorite ice cream because she was not going to talk about ice cream, think about ice cream. So her compulsion was avoidance of ice cream. Mm-hmm. Sometimes an avoidance of something is actually very, very hard to see. Right? Even yourself, like you might even be like, no, I just don't like ice cream. I don't like ice cream. And I have all these terrible thoughts in my head that are purely obsessional about ice cream, but I don't like ice cream, so I don't eat it. Well, there might be some things to challenge there about whether or not that's true. And it could be true, but it might not. And the courage is in challenging it and seeing whether it's really true, because you might find a compulsion that can help you really move forward in your life and your value system, which might be eating ice cream.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that you're acknowledging that avoidance piece too, because a lot of times the things that we can't see are rumination or avoidance. And like you said, they can be super, super, super hard to pick out. And I know for me, for years, I thought, oh, I'm not doing a compulsion. And I was either avoiding things or I was spending 10 hours a day in my head trying to figure out, am I a good person? Am I still a good person? Is this thing that I do make me a bad person? And just because someone can't see that doesn't mean I'm not compulsing for 10 hours a day and making that condition worse. So I think being able to recognize the avoidance, the rumination, it's so important as a part of the treatment.
I mean, mental checking is checking, which is a compulsion, right? And yet it's hard to see for everyone, including sometimes yourself. I liken it to sticking your tongue in a loose tooth, right? It's really hard not to do it because it's there and it feels different. And so I think that sticking your tongue in that thought in your brain to check whether you're really having it, that's a mental compulsion. And once we understand that it's a compulsion, then we can kind of lean into it, right? We can embrace it of, yes, I'm checking to see if this is true, but I'm going to embrace that it is true, possibly, maybe, and then I'm going to move on with my life. And my courage moment is in going and living whatever I was avoiding or not doing because of those 10 hours a day that I was sticking my tongue in that little mental corner of my brain. So it might be saying, gosh, I may continue thinking about this, but I'm going to go take a walk with a friend at the same time. I'm going to go read a favorite book and try to read, at least 2 pages of it before I stick my tongue back into that corner of my brain. So there's lots of ways that mental compulsions can be teased out.
Something that I see come up a lot too is emotional contamination. That's something that we sometimes miss because, for example, one that's really common is if an individual has struggled with OCD at some point in their life and it was at its absolute worst, but they're doing much, much better, all the places that individual went when their OCD was at its worst can become contaminated, or the water bottle that they drank out of when their OCD was at its worst can become contaminated. And to them, it doesn't seem like OCD from the outside perspective until we do that detective work, because in their mind, they say, well, that was just a really bad part of my life. Why would I want to bring that back in? But it is impacting them negatively on so many different levels. And so it's important to also recognize that as compulsions. But I love that you identified avoidance as absolutely a compulsion. Just like sometimes we don't catch that there's barriers being used to do certain things, like using a barrier to open a door, that would be considered a compulsion as well.
And my daughter actually hid a pair of slippers that I was wearing on a day that she threw up. Wow. And probably a year later, I found the slippers. They were a nice, cozy pair of UGG slippers, and I immediately put them on, and she immediately had a meltdown. And we dealt with that meltdown for 3 or 4 hours because it was an enormous, enormous challenge for her, but she had eliminated it by hiding the slippers from me. And so once that really came out and we dealt with that compulsion to avoid those slippers because she might throw up, we were able to kind of move on in a different way where we didn't have to have certain kinds of shoes that we were terrified of, because that was building, it was becoming a bigger and bigger thing. What happened on the day that she threw up that she now had to avoid? Everything happens in every day. So the list of things you might avoid on the day that you throw up can be immense if it continues to build.
Mm-hmm. Y'all are making me reevaluate my life and my right now with that piece of contamination. I'm thinking through. I'm navigating some things now that I potentially avoid because they remind me of times when I was really sick, and I'm wondering. I always say, "Oh, it's just because it reminds me of when I was really sick. Why do I want to, go back to that particular place or do that particular thing?" And now I'm thinking, there might be some moments of courage here where there might be some avoidance where I didn't recognize that. So again, back to advocates struggle too, and we're figuring out our lives.
We're all here. It's so interesting. I think that detective piece, because calling it detective work doesn't mean you have to do the work, right? So sometimes just acknowledging that something is a challenge is doing the work, right? Is being like, oh, wait, maybe I don't just hate books that start with Z. Maybe that's actually something that I should be dealing with. But you don't have to deal with it right that second. Detective work is just noticing. It's just noticing without judgment, right? So I love, Katie, that you just demonstrated doing that for all of us without being like, oh God, I'm so upset. Now I've got some things I've got, it's more like, oh yeah, I might want to at least try to do those things to see if it's possible. And that way I could overcome it and knock down OCD a little bit more if it wasn't, or if it turns out it wasn't a big deal, I'll be like, oh good, that really is just something I don't enjoy. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people are like, yeah, curious scientist, Ethan, exactly. Like, just be curious. Ask yourself the question of, well, could I really do it? I remember telling my therapist once when I went back into her office, I was like, that thing that we talked about my doing this week? She was like, yeah. I'm like, not only did I not do it, but I cannot do that. And she smiled and said, now the work really begins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is, again, very enlightening for me right now as well. So I appreciate this. So I want to jump to at 7:52. Jalen Coleman says, when I tell people I have OCD, they always think I'm just really organized. And this is something that we hear all the time. I know along with our back to school, this is probably something that our kids and our students will hear all the time. I know that I've had some students who have been really open about OCD, and then they'll have another student say, oh yeah, I like to organize my pens too, or I like to organize my binders too. So I wonder if either of you have anything to say about this or any advice for maybe especially our students as they're going back to school in navigating how to maybe explain OCD or respond to some of those comments.
I think that they might hear this even without disclosing that they have OCD. So it can be a tricky spot, right? Because it can kind of trigger something frustrating in you when you hear, I'm so OCD, I keep everything so organized. And so they first have to decide what they're ready to disclose, but then they can share and give the education that they feel comfortable giving. You'll absolutely hear that throughout your life. I hope now that there is more education. Of course, we have a long way to go still, that we're hearing it less and less, but it's definitely still out there, definitely still on t-shirts around Christmas time or, things like that. But the education piece is what's missing for that person. And so also maybe having a little bit of empathy for them will be important just because they don't know. And they don't know maybe because they haven't experienced it. But first asking yourself what you're willing to disclose and then moving from there is important.
Mm-hmm. And I generally like to say, as an adult, I think you're discussing the fact that you have a passion for organizing, which is different than saying that you have the disorder, which can be very debilitating and cause people to lose huge chunks of their day. And it's interesting because sometimes when people say, oh, I'm so OCD, I spend 3 hours a day cleaning my home, maybe actually they are. And so meeting them with empathy, like Cali is suggesting, and saying, well, I'll often say with curiosity, well, do you mean you have a passion for cleaning your home and it makes you really happy? Or is it preventing you from going to your kid's soccer game? Mm-hmm. Is it a disorder that's taking up more than 2 hours of your day? Or is it just something you really love? And so by asking them that question of empathy of, are you telling me something is wrong? Or are you just throwing that away? often gets them into the conversation of, and I'm amazed by the number of people when I ask that question are like, well, actually, now that you mention it, I have to stay up later than everyone else in the household because I need to do blah, 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 blah. And then I'm able to say, well, that's actually is OCD and there is help for it. And it's called exposure and ritual prevention. And there's this great website you can go to. And so I would say like half the time when someone says, I'm so OCD, they actually kind of mean it, but maybe they're testing the waters to see how it's received or to minimize what they find weird about themselves. We often see people do that. Like, I think I'm weird. I'm just going to call it out in front of everyone. And like, then they can't make fun of me because I've already made fun of myself. So I think that empathy piece is super important. And the words that I always use are, do you mean you have a passion for that? Or do you mean that it's debilitating and it's taking up more than 2 hours of your day and you wish you could do other things during that time? And I ask it very seriously, very like, oh, I'm worried you just told me something important about yourself.
I give an example too to I need to get better at it, but the people that I feel more comfortable clarifying it with. And the way I love what you say, and I might start using that, but the way I do it is I'll give the example of two people might have to have all of the cans in the fridge lined up perfectly. One person thinks, oh, I love it this way. It looks so good. It makes me feel good to have my fridge this way. The other person thinks, if I don't do this, my loved one is going to die, right? So there's like that passion component, that excitement component, and there's this like dread, fear, don't want to be doing this component.
Yeah, does it cause you joy to line up the cans in your fridge in the front direction? Or does it cause you anxiety if one is even tilted the slightest bit? Those are two very different things. I think that's a great example, Cali.
Yeah, and I think so many people get also OCD and OCPD mixed up too, and that's kind of a whole nother layer of is it something that is it giving you anxiety? Is it something that you are not wanting to actually go through with or that you're not wanting to do? I love, Susan, what you said about asking if you have a passion for it. I struggle with this all the time. And I struggle with hearing students say it all the time, but also with coworkers since I've been more public about OCD, folks trying to, I think in pre-planning week, I had at least 5 faculty members come up and say, oh, I see you do all this stuff on OCD and my kid's car, I had somebody say my kid's car is really messy and it kind of bothers me. And I think I have OCD too. So let's talk about it. And I never really know how to respond. And a lot of times I'll take it kind of offensively and think, okay, you don't really know what it is that I'm experiencing. And I love the idea of living into that in an empathetic way and being able to say, oh, well, what does that look like? Do you have a passion for cleaning? Is it something that's taking over your life and really living into it? Like, I'm taking this seriously. And how do I ask these questions? Like, what a reframe for so many of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of times people are scared to say that they do have something that's a disorder. So they're sort of asking questions around the edges of it. But that interest usually to me is a sign that someone else in their life probably has something going on. And it might not be as severe as what we experienced in our home. But, to me, if a child or an adult is losing even 30 minutes of their day to something that is causing them severe anxiety, then we can work on that. And, I often say to people, well, it doesn't matter if you have OCD or not. Let's talk about that. The one specific thing is that's really bugging you. And let's say, so it's your child's car is super messy. So let's say to your child, you know what? Let's actually throw balled up paper into the back seat and leave it there for 2 weeks. And I'm like, could you do that? And if they're like, well, yeah, I could do that. I'm like, then you're okay. You don't have a disorder. You just really wish your kid would clean up their car. And that's a whole different parenting topic that we can all share in, right? But if they're really like, oh, no, absolutely not. We're not balling up paper and throwing the back of my kid's car, whether that's because of social anxiety and they're worried about what other people might think, or whether it's because it's OCD and they're worried, that that's an unclean environment that might cause germs, or whatever the concern is, maybe we'll tease that out by saying, you're scared of your kid's car getting dirty. Let's make it dirtier. That's what exposure and prevention is, right? It's really just kind of leaning in. But I love that whole piece we're all talking about of empathy because, everybody's got a story and sometimes it seems like they don't, but they probably do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that. We had a lesson today with my students on empathy and compassion. So I'm right with you. And I never think about it in this particular way when folks say that. So I think that's awesome. I see Faith at 754 said, what are buds, roses, and thorns? I know that's not an OCD topic, but really quick, but roses are just, I go around and have the students, a rose is something that you're super excited about for the day. a thorn is something that you're maybe not so excited about, that's kind of weighing on you, and a bud is something that you're waiting to see unfold and that you're kind of anticipating. So we go through and they'll say, you know, my rose is that there's a football game tonight. My thorn is that I have a math test. My bud is that I don't know what's going to happen with this thing with my friend after school. And we do a round robin every day of all three of those, just to kind of give them space if they want to.
I like that you can have all three. You don't have to just choose your one way that you feel. That's great.
I always say pick 1, 2, or 3. And I always say, of course, if you don't feel like sharing today, you don't have to share. I'll never force you to share, but you can do, because sometimes it'll be like, I don't have a bud, but I have a rose, or I have a thorn and a bud. So it's some agency there. So at 8:04, Ethan said, Cali, advocating can be both rewarding and anxiety provoking. Has actually putting Anxious Annie and a big part of you out there in a big way made you anxious as well? And he also says, congrats on a huge accomplishment.
Oh, I love that question. Thank you, Ethan. I would say, because of the time of it didn't. I'd say I was more worried about it when I first started working with the Peace of Mind Foundation, which is another great OCD resource through IOCDF. I did a lot of advocacy work for them and started sharing my story on their social media pages. And that was a lot more nerve-wracking, especially when it linked to my own personal page, before I made it a bit more professional, because everyone from my hometown was finding out about it and I hadn't really shared it. So at that point, I was much more nervous. And by this time of releasing Anxious Annie, I had my feet a little bit sturdier in the ground and had already gotten so much feedback that this story was inspiring, or that it had given other people a sense of hope. So I felt confident about it then.
Thank you, Cali. I love that. And I think that's a great question too. And I can imagine putting yourself out there originally was challenging in some big ways. But I think the book, and I remember you saying this, and you can speak more to this too, the book for you kind of brought some communities together, right? Wasn't it kind of bringing your OCD community and your athletic community together?
Yeah. That's the neatest part about this book is that I have spoken to people that I hadn't talked to in years, that I met at some race forever ago, and they want to know more about OCD, or they're going to my Instagram page to get the link for the book, and then they see something about OCD. And so it really does tie the two worlds together, which is perfect timing because of everything that's happened with the Olympics and mental health being talked about a lot more. So the timing of it all has been spot on.
Sometimes you're in the right place at the right time, Cali.
That's right.
Absolutely. And I bet there are a lot of kids who are really impacted by that with the Olympics. I'm planning on using this with my kiddos a little bit this year as well, as we get back in and talk about the Olympics and talk about athletes and anxiety. It's just so timely, so timely. So at 8:12, the claimer says, I've been treating intrusive thoughts just as they are, intruders. So yes, absolutely, intruders. And they say, I usually tell myself, don't worry about it. It's just OCD, but I feel like it's becoming more of a compulsion. So can that become a compulsion, telling yourself, oh, it's just OCD, I'm not going to think about this? Susan, what do you think? Can that become compulsive in and of itself?
I think absolutely. And if you think it might be a compulsion, then the opposite would be to go ahead and lean into it and say, yeah, it might be true. It might absolutely be true. I might be that horrible person who is going to run someone over on the road tonight. And I'm going to get in my car and drive anyway. So, I think it's always about breaking the cycle. So I think it's great. It's actually incredibly impressive that you're recognizing that something that seems super minor, like saying, oh, it sounds like a good thing, right? Oh, it's probably just OCD. But what you're doing is exactly what we talked about earlier, which is detective work of saying, hey, this is starting to feel like a compulsion that I have to do versus something that's really helping me to lean into the anxiety and live through it. It's instead helping me avoid it. And so I would encourage you to talk to your therapist and work through a few different ways that you can overcome that with some exposure and ritual prevention techniques. But I think really just acknowledging it and knowing that that might be going on is just such an enormous first step.
Yeah, great insight and points that you made there.
Yeah.
I also ask people, did that bring your anxiety down pretty instantly? And if so, then there's a red flag that this might be a compulsion.
That's right. Yep, that's a great point. Because anxiety usually lasts for a little while. So if we're doing something to immediately relieve it, it's a little weird to say this, but that's not necessarily great. We want to lean into our anxiety and allow ourselves to feel it so that we can understand that we can tolerate it and that we can do what we want to do anyway, right? So when Annie got up to that starting line, maybe she didn't feel great the first time that she did that. Maybe that was pretty anxiety provoking. And so we really learn how to live through those moments of anxiety and do what we want to do anyway. And then eventually it feels great to walk up to the starting line, but it might, the first 5 times might feel really kind of awful when you walk up to the starting line. You might not run a very good race because you don't get off well because you're feeling so anxious at the starting line. But facing that fear is the first step, and then it really does build from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the idea of riding the wave too. With social media now, I think we have to be so careful because someone could get really triggered and then not want to lean into that and go straight to Instagram and start scrolling. Or I don't know, I guess kiddos watch YouTube channel TV stuff right now. I think that's the trend that they're on, but it's easy to almost numb.
Or TikTok, scroll through TikTok.
Yes.
Yes.
And so instead of leaning into that anxiety and feeling it, and of course it's fine for them to eventually go do something that they want to do, but if they're doing that immediately, if you notice they did something that triggered them and then said, I need my phone, I need to watch TikTok or something, then that's probably also prohibiting them from leaning into that anxiety.
Such a good example. We had to really limit screen time and make it an earned privilege in our house because anytime anxiety came up, her ability to lose herself in the screen felt like a good thing at first. Like, oh, okay, it's a good distraction. Is what we called it. But then we quickly realized that once the screen turned off, whatever it was, like reared its monster head. And then we were dealing with it even bigger because it had really been building that whole time. So we got pretty serious about not numbing fairly early in life.
Yeah, I think I love this, and the idea of leaning in, as we talk about, is so important. And even going back to just saying, "Oh yeah, don't worry about it. It's OCD." Really being a way to alleviate that anxiety, and I relate to that. I have really struggled with asking my partner, "Are you sure this one's OCD? Is this OCD too? Should I be treating this in the same way?" And I've really had to get better about catching myself doing that. And the other piece, along with what Cali said, with social media being so big, in addition to going and scrolling through TikTok or kind of numbing yourself in that way, while there are such amazing informative posts about OCD, I think that can really become compulsive in and of itself too, for folks who are saying, okay, am I sure this one's OCD? Let me go look up all of the other people who have the same types of subtypes that I do to make sure that mine fits in with that. So I can say, okay, it's just OCD. It's fine. I'm not really that bad person. And I think we have to be careful of that too.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Ethan at 814, going back to the compassion education piece, and I think a lot of folks resonated with that. He said 99% of folks just genuinely don't know or understand. There's rarely malicious intent, but I also really like Susan's thoughts that they're tossing out to test. I've always used humor in many situations to test an insecurity, but was actually being sincere when I played it off or as a joke. So I love going back to that compassion piece again of what Susan was kind of teaching us of, we don't have to get really angry about it. It's if we can respond in a compassionate way, and it can be kind of a teaching and maybe a learning moment for both of us. It looks like Kate was loving the conversation too, and Alexandra as well. So thank you, Alexandra. And let's see if we have, okay, perfect. We're starting to run low on time. So I want to ask one final question. And really, I'm wondering as we kind of finish off tonight, we're thinking about this whole topic around going back to school, anxiety heading back to school, and just wrapping up for tonight. If there was maybe one thing that you could share with a student who has OCD, who is heading back to school this year, who might be struggling, who might be anxious, whether that's about running in their races or giving a class presentation or about the intrusive thoughts that might come up. Do you have a piece of advice that you might offer them for this school year?
First, I'd start off by saying you are not alone. There's a lot of other students that are struggling with that same fear, to just normalize it and let them feel less isolated. And then second, I would also add that, remember, your worth is not just defined by this one moment. There's so much more after this, which can help take the pressure off so that they can focus on the exposure that they need to lean into.
And I would really ask, in addition to all of that, because that's all it's just good stuff. And the other thing is, people with OCD often put a lot of pressure on themselves to overcome OCD, right? I need to overcome OCD. That's the new goal. That's what my entire life is focused on. And so, especially for our students that are heading back to school, but really all of us, it's to have some compassion for yourself and to say, what is the smallest fear that I have that I could take on and see if I can manage it? And so do a little more detective work and, look through, be honest with yourself about what 5 or 10 things are that you're really scared to do. And if you discover that the smallest one is raising your hand in class and answering one question, and it's in the classroom with the friendliest teacher, that's okay. Choose that one first. Because really, okay, I like to put it this way. If you're learning to play soccer, okay, you're going to have to learn how to kick the ball first. Once you learn how to dribble, you can learn how to run down the field. Don't be afraid to just learn how to kick the ball. You don't have to score a goal on your first time out. All I want you to do is find your tiniest thing that you're afraid of and walk into that. And trust yourself that it's kind of like soccer or weightlifting or whatever it is. You got to start with the tiny weights and build your way up. And we're often impatient about that. It's not just kids. All of us want to be superstars right away, right? All of us want to be Cali and be at the Olympics. But I'm really just starting with trying to walk 3 days a week. So that's good for me. And that's what my goal is. That's my first thing I'm tackling. So what's your smallest thing you could tackle?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you, Cali. And I'm sure there are kids and families and others who are hearing that who are really inspired, kind of thinking about what they can go out and what the smallest thing they might be able to tackle can be for this school year, or just as they move into this week. So in closing out tonight, just a couple reminders. So registration right now is open for the 1 Million Steps for OCD walk. 36 walks are happening around the country, including the flagship in Boston, which will be held September 18th. So please try to find a walk near you and register. And also registration is open for the online OCD conference taking place October 8th to 10th. So you can learn more and register at iocdf.org/conference. I know we spent some time talking about that tonight. And while that is virtual this year, there are still going to be amazing connections, amazing speakers, great opportunities just for community, for learning more about OCD, but also just connecting with others. So we really, really encourage you to sign up. And then even just next week, we have some great streams going on. We would encourage you to join the Peace of Mind virtual community at iocdf.org/peace of mind. There you can view the live stream schedule and submit topics and questions for future events. For instance, Tuesday, August the 24th at 7 p.m., there is a Just Ethan with special guests Liz and Chris, and they're going to talk about body image in education, continuing our education theme. And then Wednesday, August 25th at 12 p.m., Chris's Corner will be focused on struggling in school. I'm excited to be on there with him that day to get to talk about what that looks like to struggle in school and continue this great conversation too. And then next Thursday, August 26th at 7 p.m., there will be trivia with Ethan and Fran. So as always, I know you won't want to miss that. So I think we actually got to all of our questions tonight, but if you had a question that we didn't answer, please reach out to the IOCDF at info@iocdf.org. And if you need other resources, you are more than welcome to visit iocdf.org, where you can find all the resources under the sun, including the Anxiety in the Classroom page, which we talked about frequently tonight, and the link for that is in the chat. And finally, if you enjoyed our book tonight, which I know I did, you are more than welcome, and we encourage you to buy Cali's book here, Anxious Annie. And we're going to put the link to in the chat as well. And we encourage you to share that with your family and with your friends, and for children and adults alike, because I think it just speaks to so many of us in such beautiful ways. So please remember to please remember to subscribe to the IOCDF on all of the platforms. And we are just so thankful that you were here with us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next time.